Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the Rules Committee is convening to consider three separate measures: HJ Res 42, HJ Res 61, SJ Res 11. Before I discuss these three measures, let me make one thing abundantly clear. Gone are the days of the government knows best mentality that Americans suffered under the Biden administration. For 4 straight years, the Biden administration worked hard to deny freedom of consumer choice in all aspects of our lives. Like the American people, the private sector also found itself under the thumb of an administration hell-bent on mandating subservience and control. Companies found themselves twisted in regulatory knots because the Biden administration issued misguided mandate after misguided mandate. The onslaught was never ending. But it's a new day. We have a Republican-controlled Congress, and President Trump is back at the White House. We're determined to give American consumers choice again and allow the business community to flourish and create unbridled value without the threat of government encroachment. Now on to our first measure, HJ Res 42, a Congressional Review Act resolution that would nullify a Department of Energy rule that pushes arbitrary product mandates that drive up costs for consumers and hamstrings consumer choice. I said this during our last meeting, and I'll say it again. Consumer choice is not something to be trifled with. This rule is devoid of any reasonable solution to increase the efficiency of consumer products. Ordinary consumers stand to gain absolutely nothing from it. Our next measure is HJ Res 61, a Congressional Review Act resolution that will nullify a midnight rule issued by the Environmental Protection Agency that slaps dubious emission standards on the manufacturing of rubber tires. What's particularly risible about the EPA's rule is that the agency's own risk review found that the rule was not necessary to protect public health and, in fact, may even increase carbon emissions. That same risk review could not quantify any public health benefits from the rule. The sheer level of incompetence that went into formulating this rule in the first place is mind-boggling. Our last measure is SJ Res 11, a Congressional Review Act resolution that would nullify another midnight rule issued by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that specifically targets American energy producers with a barrage of unnecessary regulations. The justification for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's rule is to, quote, better protect shipwrecks and other cultural resources on the seabed from potential harm due to offshore oil and gas activities, end quote. The mandate is completely misguided, and it will force American energy producers to spend untold resources on scouring ocean seafloors for potential shipwrecks without having a single indication of whether they exist in the area. We're returning to American energy dominance again in our country, and this rule acts as another regulatory cog that will do more harm than good. It's time that we put these three Biden administration rules through the shredder and move forward. Common sense has returned. With that, I look forward to today's discussion, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any comments he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of our former Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart. Lincoln served on the Rules Committee, and while we didn't always agree, I respected him because he believed in the power of good governance and fair debate. He understood that our role as lawmakers is about working for the American people, and it was an honor to serve with him, and my prayers go out to his family at this difficult time.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. I appreciate your doing that.
And now on to the business of the day. Madam Chair, last week, Republicans passed a budget resolution that paves the way for their betrayal of the middle class, stealing from hardworking people so they can give tax breaks to billionaires. This week, they are doubling down, dismantling protections that keep people healthy and safe. Even worse, while Republicans complain about home appliances and car tires, issues that don't even crack the top 100 concerns that I hear from my constituents, the GOP is quietly pushing Trump's broader agenda of destruction. Now, just look at what is happening. DOGE sacked hundreds of workers who keep our nuclear weapons safe, then scrambled to rehire those workers when they realized they screwed up. They fired critical staff from VA hospitals, including disabled veterans. They decimated the NIH office responsible for groundbreaking research on Alzheimer's and dementia. They dismantled Ebola prevention teams along with other critical disease surveillance programs, despite there being a nationwide measles outbreak for the first time in decades. They cut experts working on the bird flu response, you know, the thing that is making eggs so expensive and causing shortages. And now they are working to try to hire them back. I mean, talk about efficiency. We have wildfires raging in South Carolina as Elon guts FEMA, Trump golfs in Florida, and J.D. Vance hits the slopes in Vermont. Can you imagine if Joe Biden went golfing during the California fires? You guys would have a meltdown. But when it's the dear leader, Donald Trump, suddenly it's all fine. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the disgraceful spectacle in the Oval Office last week. You know, I just got home from meeting with my constituents in a town hall, and I called Coffee with Your Congressman in Leominster, Massachusetts. It isn't exactly a Democratic stronghold. Normally, I get about 30 or 40 people show up. This week, we had well over 300 people show up. And the people who showed up were overwhelmingly disgusted, embarrassed, and angry over what transpired at the White House on Friday between President Trump and President Zelensky. I watched the entire video. Not once did Trump or J.D. Vance say a single negative thing about Vladimir Putin. Not a single bad word for the bloodthirsty dictator who invaded Ukraine. Not a single word of support for our allies in Ukraine who are just fighting against Russian aggression. And it seems like people need a little bit of a history lesson. You know, when the Soviet Union fell in the late 90s, Ukraine was left with the world's third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons on the planet. In turn, they signed an agreement with us, the United Kingdom, and Russia, in which they agreed to give up all those weapons if we, the other three signers, agreed to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. So Ukraine and Russia already had a peace agreement. Russia violated it. Russia invaded Ukraine, and the fastest way for this war to end is for Russia to stop the invasion. We, the United States, we also signed that agreement. We promised to help protect Ukraine's freedom, and Trump is not living up to that agreement. So long as Trump backtracks, no one is going to trust our word, and that's exactly what Russia wants. Just after the meeting, the Kremlin spokesman said, and I quote, "The new U.S. administration is rapidly changing all foreign policy configurations. This largely coincides with our vision," end quote. Do you know what that sounds like? It sounds like our national leaders are in the pockets of the Russian government. It sounds like Trump and Vance are playing right into Putin's hands, undermining our allies and aligning with our adversaries. In fact, just for the sake of argument, let's say we had a president who was doing Putin's bidding, who was secretly trying to undermine the United States, and that president wanted to destroy us from within. You know what they would probably do? Well, they would dismantle our professional civil service. They would withdraw from the world and threaten to leave NATO. They would shut down foreign aid. They would turn their backs on our allies and embrace our adversaries. And they might weaken our ability to fight off Russian cyber operations against U.S. critical infrastructure. Do those things sound familiar? Because I think they do. And let's be clear, everything I have mentioned, dismantling regulations, destroying institutions, abandoning our global commitments, makes Americans less safe, not more. And let me make one more thing clear. Republicans own this. You control the House, You control the Senate, and you control the White House. We do not live in a dictatorship. You could stand up to this stuff, but you don't. You could provide oversight on the very real, very massive scandals happening right now, but you won't. You could pass real policies to bring down the cost of food, stop the egg shortage, help middle-class families, and protect this country, but you're not. Instead, you're stealing from the middle class to enrich billionaires, trying to overturn Biden-era rules no one has ever even heard of, and offering the Western world on a platter to dictators. So, well, we're not going to stand by while extremists dismantle our government and hurt everyday Americans. The Republican agenda comes at the expense of the people we were all elected to serve. Enough is enough, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses have will be included in the record. I welcome our first panel, Chairman Guthrie and Ranking Member Pallone from the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. I remind our witnesses that your full statement may be submitted for the record, and we ask that you summarize your statement in 5 minutes. Chairman Guthrie, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and thank you, Ranking Member McGovern and members of the Rules Committee for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm pleased to speak in support of 2 resolutions of disapproval introduced under the Congressional Review Act to repeal some of President Biden's overreaching regulations. H.J. Res. 42, introduced by Congressman Andrew Clyde, seeks to repeal another Biden-Harris rule that increases red tape and costs for manufacturers and ultimately American consumers. This final rule amended or created new certification, labeling, and enforcement provisions for 20 different products, including dishwashers, central air conditioning, heat pumps, clothes washers, and many other appliances that American families and businesses rely upon. Several appliances subject to these new requirements are products with energy efficiency standards recently amended by the Biden DOE in an unworkable manner. Over the last 4 years, nearly 30 energy efficiency regulations have been issued, totaling over $60 billion in costs. The Biden administration's DOE proposed and finalized new standards to regulate virtually every appliance American consumers rely on in their homes, forcing families to spend more for less reliable options. Implementing these layers of requirements will further solidify the disastrous standard promulgated under the last administration. Today, homeowners spend about 34% more on appliances than they did 15 years ago. From 1995 to 2005, the average homeowner replaced their appliances every 12 to 13 years. Now that timeline has shrunk to every 8 to 9. Unreasonable certification, labeling, and reporting requirements will further increase costs and slow the development of reliable products. In fact, DOE itself estimates these requirements will increase annual costs by $213,000 for manufacturers and result in nearly 3,000 hours of additional paperwork for companies to complete. And while my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will argue this rule will not impact consumer choice, these additional costs placed on manufacturers will be passed down to American families, households, and businesses. While some wealthy homeowners may be able to afford the increased burden, millions of hardworking Americans can't. And last November, Americans clearly demanded a return to common sense policies where homeowners drive decisions, not Washington bureaucrats pushing an agenda. And unfortunately, the ultimate harm falls on the American consumer. We need to end this failed approach. I'm also here to speak on H.J. Res. 61, led by my good friend and Environmental Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Griffith, member of this committee. Madam Chairwoman, there is a misconception coming from our friends on the other side of the aisle that we heard several times last week here in this committee and on the House floor, that Republicans do not care about the environment and do not want to reduce emissions, and those statements are simply not true. We do not support policies that put unnecessary burdens on businesses in an attempt to appease the climate lobby, and this is why EPA rule must be repealed. Tire manufacturing companies already comply with existing EPA standards to reduce emissions or hazardous air pollutants from rubber mixers. This Biden rule put forth in the waning days of his administration will add emissions limits for total hydrocarbons to the existing national standards for hazardous air pollutants, or NESHAP standards. Madam Chairwoman, there is not a correlation between these two pollutants, and yet EPA wants to impose serious financial burdens that would drive facilities out of business and destroy domestic manufacturing. This rule by the Biden EPA amounts to arbitrary virtue signaling by the last administration and ultimately fails even to identify how implementation of this rule will reduce HAP emissions. To meet these limits, facilities will need to install regenerative thermal oxidizers, or RTOs, which require significant amounts of natural gas to combust pollutants. In 2020, the EPA even released a risk assessment that stated that the tire manufacturing industry's HAPs were under an acceptable threshold. As such, this rule must be repealed. Urge my colleagues to join me in supporting these important resolutions, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Pallone.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And thank you, Ranking Member McGovern and the other members of the Rules Committee. I'm here to testify on HJ Res 61 and HJ Res 42. I strongly oppose both of these resolutions. Now, Mr. McGovern talked about town meetings in his opening, and Chairwoman Fox talked about the business community. But I will say that when I go back home, including this weekend, I don't hear about any of this stuff that we're dealing with today. I mean, what I hear, because you said, what do you hear? I hear that people are very concerned about the economy, right? In other words, I hear, with all the federal workers being laid off, with all the freezes on money, particularly for infrastructure in New Jersey, and with the tariffs that the president says he's going to impose tomorrow in Canada and Mexico, people are really worried about the economy. They think that these policies are leading to a recession, and that's what the business community is concerned about, and the public. So, the president made a lot of promises to the American people, promised to lower costs, promised to make America healthy again, promised to put America first. But I don't see any of those things happening, anything being done really to promote the well-being of Americans. And I also worry that Elon Musk is, trying to gut our federal government to the harm of the American people. So I don't think the resolutions before us today do absolutely nothing to help the American people, Mr. McGovern, in answer to your sort of question. And in the case of HJ Res 61, the first one with regard to rubber, it would actively harm Americans' health. So HJ Res 61 would hamstring EPA's ability to protect the public from the most harmful air pollutants, literally cancer-causing air toxics, at a time when Republicans are also on the cusp of taking away health care because of the potential cuts in Medicaid. It's not going to do anything to repeal this rule. Because the rule is essentially a common sense, cost-effective way to ensure that rubber tire manufacturers stay competitive. And the rule promotes innovation by recognizing top performers in the industry and promotes current technologies that reduce emissions and make these facilities better and safer. What I see today with both of these rules, and what I saw last week when we were dealing with the efficiency standards and other things, is that these standards actually protect the good actors, the good manufacturers, the one that want to do the right thing, right? And it's the bad actors, the foreign manufacturers, who want to sell cheap stuff that's not safe or not healthy. They're the ones that benefit, right? So nobody benefits here. America's not put first. America's put last, in my opinion. If Republicans want to make America healthy again, then they should start by insisting on clean air and not free passes for corporate polluters. And EPA's rule doesn't apply to the entire rubber manufacturing industry, just a handful of facilities that process rubber, and they have years to comply. But I also want to say, because we have the chairman of the committee here today, it's not even clear what these resolutions are doing. We've had no regular order in our committee in Energy and Commerce. You have a hearing in the subcommittee, you have a markup in the subcommittee, you have a markup in the full committee, and that's an opportunity to actually see what is going on here. And particularly with the second one, which I'm going to get to now, I have absolutely no idea what you're trying to accomplish. This is the one with, it doesn't even apply to the appliance efficiency. It targets how manufacturers certify that they are compliant with efficiency standards. And I have a document here. I can submit it for the record, Madam Chair, if that's all right.
Without objection.
Thank you. From the American Appliance Business Association. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's one paragraph, because it talks about these certifications, because again, we're not talking about the standards, but the compliance with the standards and the certification of those compliance, it says that in comments on September 2023 proposed rule for certification requirements, the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers said, and I quote, that consistent, clear, transparent certification criteria are a critical part of the program, and that we appreciate DOE's proposals that are aimed at ensuring consistency between testing to support certification and testing DOE does to support its enforcement efforts. I think that's what you're talking about here, and they have no problem with it. I don't know if the manufacturers have no problem with it. I don't understand why we're even doing this, because I said the resolution doesn't target efficiency standards like last week with the water heaters, but instead targets how manufacturers certify that they are compliant with the standards. So what does that mean? In my opinion, it means you have nothing else to do here. I mean, did you just like open the Federal Register and search for what fell under the Congressional Review Act window and then find some, non-controversial rule that's supported by the manufacturers? I have no idea. Who gains from the passage of this resolution? As I said, the answer is very similar to last week's resolution attacking water heaters, only foreign manufacturers. You create regulatory uncertainty. Bill creates an opportunity for cheap foreign imports to flood the market and mislead American consumers, because the American manufacturers don't support the resolution. It doesn't help American consumers. It doesn't help lower costs. It doesn't help American manufacturers. I don't even think it helps Republicans' polluter friends, to be honest. I don't know who it helps. I just think that, you guys are out of touch, frankly. The government funding runs out in less than 2 weeks, and rather than talking about what needs to be done there, you're talking about certifying the standards. And again, this is not what the American people are interested in. It's certainly not what you talked about, and we really need to go back to the committee, Mr. Chairman, and have a hearing on these things before they come before rules. But with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I will pass and I will yield to Mr. Griffith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, for being here. I really appreciate you here to talk about my bill. It's interesting. Heard my good friend saying, Mr. Pallone saying that this isn't what people are talking about back home. I can assure you that's what they'll be talking about in my hometown of Salem, Virginia, and in Roanoke County, when formerly Mohawk, now Yokohama Tires, been that way for about 20 years, who makes tires in my hometown and employs a lot of people in the 9th District, starts having to maybe lay off people, because many of our tire plants in the United States won't be able to meet these standards, and some of them will cut back production or go out of business. So, yeah, you're right. They may not be talking about it today. They may not have talked about it on Saturday. But when the layoff notices go out, they're going to be talking about it. And that's why we're doing this, is we're trying to prevent those layoff notices from going out. In my home region, I'm proud to use those tires on a regular basis, because I know that when I buy those tires, one, they're good quality tires, they're going to last a long time, and I'm providing, even if it's a small measure, my little 4 tires on my vehicle aren't going to keep the plant open or keep it from having layoffs, but it goes a little bit of the way of helping there. And unfortunately, I'm afraid what the EPA has done for many years, Madam Chair, is it has not looked at the job consequences in the community. It has not looked at what the economic impacts are. It's okay if we send these plants to other parts of the world where they will pollute outrageously, instead of doing it here more reasonably. Now, Mr. Chairman, is that kind of your understanding of why I put this bill in?
Absolutely. I don't think I can improve on what you just said.
Yeah.
I agree.
And I would ask you, was the EPA able to quantify whether hazardous air pollutants would be reduced by this rule?
They were not.
They weren't even able, they didn't even try. This was just something they thought, oh, it looks like we ought to be doing something, so we're going to do something, without making a detailed quantification on whether the hazardous air pollutants that they're trying to control would even be reduced by this rule. That's what makes this so hard. My folks could be negatively impacted, but the EPA didn't take the time to make sure of what they were doing. Now, if we repeal this rule, would other EPA NESHAPs apply to rubber tire plants? That's other regulations that they have?
Yes, they would.
And would the repeal of this rule prevent the EPA from issuing a modified rules or modified rules for rubber tire plants? Not exactly like this one, but on other categories of air pollution?
My understanding, it wouldn't.
Yeah, it's my understanding too. You know, this is the problem with the EPA. They come out with these rules. And it won't be the first time that my district's lost jobs. Towns, I mean, I had a town that basically gave up its charter this year. Why? Because a number of years ago, EPA came out with rules. The local industry shut down because of those rules. A month after they shut down, might have been 3.5 weeks, but roughly a month after they shut down, the rule of the EPA was stricken by the Supreme Court. They hadn't done it right, and they took it down, but the plant didn't reopen. And the jobs were lost, and local businesses closed. And as a result, this year the town turned in its charter, and it's just one of those census areas now as opposed to being a town. That's the kind of bad stuff that happens when we don't go in to check what we're really doing and make sure that the impact of the regulation is actually quantifiable to make air better. We just go forward because it sounds good. Isn't that right?
That's correct, and also to comply with the rule, you have to use more energy, so it estimated it actually will increase carbon dioxide.
Wow. Wow. And in the meantime, many of the facilities making tires in the United States will have to either shutter or reduce their production, as a result of which there will be more and more foreign tires coming in, and frankly, I'd rather buy American. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ranking Member McGovern.
Mr. Plone, do you want to respond to any of that?
Again, you know, part of my concern here that I expressed is that with both of these rules, no hearing in subcommittee, no markup in subcommittee, no markup in full committee, which is regular order. And I think, you know, Mr. Griffith, you mentioned, you know, that we don't really check what we're doing. I think that that's the problem here. In other words, look, my understanding is that Yokohama, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Isn't even covered by this EPA rule or by this resolution, because the EPA rule, as I said, doesn't apply to the entire rubber tire manufacturing industry, just a handful of facilities that process rubber, as I said, who have years to comply. And that is the case with Yokohama. They're not actually covered by the rule. And I don't even know if Yokohama is part of this group, but as I mentioned, the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers has said that they have no problem with this EPA rule. Maybe Yokohama is not part of that group. I have no idea. But I just feel that, you know, it's kind of like the same thing. A gentleman from Georgia last week on the home water heaters, you know, talked about his company, this Japanese company that was manufacturing these things in his district. And it turned out they were the only group that opposed this. And what we found out was that all they had to do was spend, I don't know how much, I think it was about $10 million, and they were making so much money in order to do what the American manufacturers were doing, and they refused to do it. And so they were the ones that were saying, well, we should get rid of this rule. So again, I don't know what to say. I think if we had an opportunity to look at this, we would find out who isn't impacted. Yokohama is not impacted based on what I've been able to find out. And the American manufacturers, I mean, I know Yokohama makes them here, but they're still a Japanese company, and I love Japan, so I'm not trying to say, you know, Japan's no good, but thankfully, at least they're manufacturing here. But the bottom line is, these resolutions come before rules without having any input from Energy and Commerce. Examples are being brought up, which I don't think the rule applies to. And with the exception, maybe no exceptions, the American manufacturers have no problem with it.
Well, I
I don't know what to
you
say,
just
Mr.
made the case
Chairman.
why hearings are important. And hopefully in the future, my Republican colleagues will actually take the time and do hearings and bring these bills to the floor under regular order. Chairman Guthrie, as you heard in my opening statement, I just find it really hard to believe that these are the most pressing items on your agenda as the chairman of the committee with broad jurisdiction over this country's healthcare system. And I've read that you guys have been told not to do town halls anymore, but as I mentioned in my opening, I've been doing a lot of town halls, and several hundred of my constituents showed up just on Saturday to tell me it was on their mind, and none of them brought up tires or appliances. But they did bring up how disgusted they are with DOGE cuts, and they objected to the awful budget that you guys jammed through, which goes after Medicaid. So I just want to ask you some questions about some things that actually matter to a lot of Americans. Chairman Guthrie, last month, rape crisis centers that support domestic violence survivors had to stop taking on new clients because the administration froze funding for CDC's Rape Prevention and Education Program. Do you have a date when your committee might do an oversight hearing on that matter?
We don't have a date set for that.
All right. What about when the administration slashed funding for NIH clinical trials? I convened a roundtable in my district at UMass Medical School. I not only listened to researchers, but to parents of sick children who are counting on these trials and are very scared and upset. I just met today, some of you may have as well, with individuals who have type 1 diabetes, and they're in town. Again, really deeply concerned about cuts in NIH as well as cuts in Medicaid, but do we have a date for a hearing to address the cutting of medical programs for?
We don't have a date for a hearing on that, but in the last hearing that we had, we discussed this, our last markup, we discussed this, and we're going to do oversight to make sure that we have the right research in NIH and
Well,
FDA
yeah,
you're also referring to as well.
Yeah. What about the fact that 1/10 of the workers have been let go at NIH's Center for Alzheimer's and Related Dementias, including leading Alzheimer's researchers who have, again, I mean, it would seem to me that that's urgent enough when there should be hearings scheduled on that at the very least. You know, and let me ask you about what's on everybody's minds, and that is the cuts that are proposed to Medicaid, which would threaten 80 million children and adults who receive health care through Medicaid and CHIP. I mean, will your portion of the reconciliation bill cut Medicaid?
My assessment, we haven't sat down and had our markup yet, but you won't have the children that are, what we will offer will not affect children, disabled, people in the traditional
Well,
Medicaid program.
who will?
Able-bodied working adults.
So you're going to cut? I mean,
When we won't cut, we'll ask them to work.
yeah. I mean, and Mr. Pallone, how much does the budget propose to cut Medicaid?
Well, 880 billion, but that was instructions to
Right.
the committee, but my understanding is they're looking for another 500 billion across all the committees, and so it'd probably be over $1 trillion for us.
But we have broad jurisdiction, so it's not all
So,
going
so,
to be in
so,
Medicaid.
so, but this is actually good news. If you're going to tell me that you're going to find all those savings, and nobody is going to lose their health care, no one's.
Just say this, Chairman Guthrie mentioned work requirements. First of all, in Georgia, which is the only state that has it right now, we found out that nobody was eliminated. With the work requirements, all they did was eliminate people that were already working. Right? It's just that the paperwork prevented people from actually filing the paperwork, and they lost their insurance. But even if you did that, and you had that across the board in every state, and everyone lost their insurance because they didn't file the paper, you're talking less than $100 billion. So where's this trillion coming from?
But put me down as skeptical that somehow you're going to make these cuts and there's going to be no adverse impacts. But as we speak, and one reason why I am skeptical is because as we speak, people are beginning to feel the actions of this administration. I just met with a group of veterans who are deeply concerned about the firing of veterans from the VA health system. The suicide prevention hotline was shut down because of some of the layoffs in the New England region. And so I know you've only been chairman for 2 months, so, you know, but I think I'm stating what you already know, but part of your job here is to provide oversight, not just of the previous administration, but more importantly, of this administration right now. And it's to make sure the American people are protected by preserving programs like Medicaid that in some cases, keep them alive. And I don't think it's the job of the committee to, to turn a blind eye when programs that impact Alzheimer's research are being cut. And again, I certainly don't think that, the American people want to see these deep cuts in Medicaid. I think most Americans think that, victims of domestic violence, should not be adversely impacted by what Elon Musk is doing, and there ought to be an investigation into that. And I think that's where I wish your committee were focused on right now, not on these CRAs that, again, with all this happening, I mean, there's an urgency here. So I would hope that the next time we see you that we'll be talking about something more substantive and something, quite frankly, that responds to what most of my constituents and countless people all across the country are really concerned about at this moment. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind the members that what we are here for today is HJ Res 42, Energy Conservation Program for Appliance Standards, and HJ Res 61, which is National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, rubber tire manufacturing. And I'm sure that what the ranking member was going off on, and it will be dealt with in committee. For the hearings that you were asking about earlier, there'll be hearings, and I'm sure that there will be sufficient discussion in the committees soon. But we are here for HJ Res 42 and HJ Res 61. And with that, I would yield to Mr. Jack of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And first, I want to thank the ranking member for your comments on Mr. Diaz-Balart. And likewise, I want to commend the chairman for passage of HJ Res 20 last week. And to the ranking member, I've got to at least rebut on behalf of my constituents as it relates to that, very specifically, that the issue last week that we found was that a company within my congressional district that manufactures water heaters, non-condensing tankless water heaters, was the victim of this rule and regulation. I think you find that a lot of its competitors wanted this rule to go forward because it limited competition in the American workplace. It would have put these folks out of business. So I'm proud that we passed that. I want to commend Chairman Guthrie for your leadership on that issue specifically, and look forward to seeing what happens in the Senate. But I did encourage and I did welcome our debate last week on the floor. On this specific resolution that the chairwoman just noted, I want to thank Mr. Griffith for his leadership. I too have tire manufacturers in my district. I've got Bridgestone, an American company that is imperiled by this. I've got Bridgestone, works in the same county as the water heaters, so it's very a good county for American manufacturing. But if I could ask the chairman, just for the record and for everyone that may be watching, just to walk through just what tire manufacturers what costs they would incur if this rule were to go forward.
Well, they would have to do it's a regenerative, I said RTO, regenerative, I have to get that actual term in front of me, they would have to expend money putting RTOs, it's regenerative. I got the one in front of me. Let me find exactly what that stands for, so I'll make sure I get it right for the record. But they'll have to expend money to for the hydrocarbons out of the air. I don't have the exact number. I gave you the number, but the hydrocarbons out of the air that really didn't have a finding through EPA. But they would also have to expend energy to do that. So the argument is that they would have to use more CO2 than is normally required. So instead of getting a minimal or no benefit from one pollutant would allow the other, what some others would call a pollutant as well, would increase in the others.
And we found this rule was issued just after Thanksgiving, which seems consistent with the last administration's policy of issuing rules right after holidays when not a lot of folks are watching. And I just was curious if, for the record, you could walk through, to the extent you're familiar with the history of it, how did this come to be at the time that it came? What data did EPA collect to put us in this perspective?
So the word for RTO is regenerative thermal oxidizers. I'm not familiar with the data that they brought forward.
Sure. And then as it relates to the other resolution that we're debating here today, curious was with respect to some of the appliance industry, some of the requirements and regulations that were foisted on them through this most recent rule. Could you walk us through for manufacturers of those appliances, what these labels would, additional challenges that would come from some of the labeling process?
Well, a lot of them are duplicative and into ongoing reporting requirements. They have to submit to EPA, and they already submit to EPA in the Energy Star program. And it requires the collection of unnecessary data in order to meet the collection provisions. And the unnecessary and duplicative nature of this final rule will increase work for manufacturers while doing nothing to lower costs for consumers.
Well, I want to commend your committee, again, on passage last week. That was very important to my district, very important to my constituents, and likewise to Mr. Griffith. Appreciate your leadership on this specific resolution, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. I have to share the concerns raised by the ranking member and by my constituents that, we're kind of wasting time rolling through these CRAs when there's certainly more pressing issues, including a budget cliff coming at us full steam. But we're considering more CRAs today. And once again, it does appear that our Republican colleagues are putting company profits over clean air and family budgets. Like all of the CRAs we've considered here, they have the same goal. They help companies make more profit by shifting the costs of their businesses onto the American people. We just had a question about the costs that tire manufacturers would incur in order to comply with a rule rather than poisoning their neighbors. So I've spoken repeatedly about the benefits of energy efficiency standards for American consumers, both in reducing energy costs and protecting the environment. So I won't repeat those points today, other than to say that I remain opposed to efforts such as HJ Res 42 to gut those standards. But I have to address the second CRA before us, HJ Res 61, which would roll back protections to the public from hazardous air pollutants generated by rubber tire manufacturing, and particularly the dangerous and carcinogenic chemicals and waste products produced in that process. Over the years, my district has seen up close the health hazards caused by tires and tire fires when they release toxic smoke and carcinogens. We know firsthand both the immediate impact of such emissions on those who have asthma, and children in our region have the highest asthma rate in the country, and the long-term impact of carcinogens on those who come in contact with these processes. The EPA rule under attack here would ensure that companies that make tires emit fewer hazardous air pollutants. In other words, this rule ensures that tire manufacturers don't inflict health burdens on the people who live downwind from their companies. Tire manufacturers emit 171 tons of carcinogenic emissions every year. And evidence shows that there's a significant health impact on those who live nearby. But apparently, our Republican colleagues think that tire manufacturers' profits are more important than Americans' health. The trade-off that this CRA represents is not a one-off, but a hallmark of the policy priorities we're seeing from congressional Republicans in the Trump administration to put their billionaire friends and corporate profits ahead of the health and well-being of the American people. They're rolling back regulations that protect our health and environment. They're slashing programs that support Americans' health, whether it's teeing up drastic cuts to Medicaid in their budget bills, firing thousands of workers at the VA, NIH, and Social Security Administration, stopping development of next year's flu vaccine. I had a number of constituents concerned about that this weekend at home, and mishandling the spreading outbreak of measles across the country. So I think our colleagues have made themselves clear. They're willing to sacrifice the health of Americans to justify giving more tax cuts and profits to their corporate buddies. But of course, none of this addresses underlying issues of the cost of eggs or mortgage rates. So before we move on, Mr. Pallone, there was a suggestion that the EPA hadn't weighed either the monetary or health costs that are implicated in devising this rule about toxic, hazardous air pollutants from rubber tire manufacturing. Can you tell us about that process?
Well, I appreciate you bringing it up. I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that, it wasn't even clear what these resolutions did because it didn't go through the committee. or that actually, the good manufacturers actually don't have any problem with these rules because it's only the bad actors that do, right? Or the foreign manufacturers or foreign companies. But I think the more fundamental thing, which you brought up, Ms. Scanlon, is that, this is being done because we want to protect American consumers, right? So what happens with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, whatever, is that the EPA has an obligation under the law to periodically review what's going on and see whether it's harmful. And they have determined that with regard to these rubber tires, that their manufacturing is increasing air pollution and toxics and therefore affecting Americans' health. They don't make this stuff up. They have an obligation to do it under the law. They then go out and, do the testing, and they meet with the manufacturers. And generally speaking, what happens is they come up with an agreement with at least the good manufacturers, good actors, that say, okay, if we do this, we'll reduce the amount of air pollution into the atmosphere, and at the same time, we won't harm your business. And so for the most part, everything we're discussing today and last week as well on the floor are things that are in that the most manufacturers, particularly the American ones, agree with and don't really have a problem with. So that's the process. They're required to do it under the law. They meet with the manufacturers, and the good guys come up with a way of doing this that is articulated in the rule.
Yeah, it was interesting just reading the limited information that we have here, because of course there was no markup to actually dig into this, that this goes back to 2002 when the standards were initially set up, but additional information, the science has advanced over time to disclose additional dangers to the American people. So if there was no markup and it's bad actors who were involved, it kind of makes you wonder why this bill is before us. Who pushed for it? How much did they contribute to the inaugural fund in order to get this bill on the floor? Well, I thank you for the information, the attention you paid to this, and I would yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Norman?
I want to thank both Mr. Pallone and Mr. Guthrie for being here. Let me just and we are here to discuss the HRES 61 and SJ Res 11, but for those who are viewing this at home, for the ranking member to say he went to town halls and heard all these complaints, let me tell you the things that I'm hearing from the public. I'm hearing about the $784 million for the new embassy that Elon Musk discovered in South Sudan. I'm hearing about the $45 million that was spent on DEI in Burma. I'm hearing about the 36 contracts across 6 agencies that spent $165 million of taxpayers' money for climate surveys. I'm hearing about $500,000 in Politico, which is a partisan magazine or paper. I'm hearing about the $182 million in HHS, and of that, $168,000 went to the Fauci exhibit. So I'm hearing about the great things that are being discovered, and if the ranking member has a problem with that, there's more to come. This is just one agency. I hadn't heard the exact amount that Stacey Abrams got, but I hear it's a pretty good sum of money that had been funneled to her. All that to say that what we saw on TV with Zelensky, it's such a relief to have a president who is in charge, who's not letting these foreign actors come in here and basically have their way with our tax money. So it's a welcome relief. The American people understand it, and we've got a president now that's not asleep. He can just make decisions, and the American people saw the last 4 years of what this administration has done to housing costs, what they've done to inflation, what they've done to basically try to destroy the American life and way of life, which, thank God, is under a new leadership now. But on these 2 resolutions, Brett, Mr. Pallone, I take issue with you on the manufacturers agree with regulations being put on by EPA. I sat in one on the manufactured housing. It wasn't either one of these, but the regulations the Biden administration was going to put on them, they violently agreed with. On this particular one, I've heard from makers who, in my district, who make dishwashers, who their livelihood comes from the sale of dishwashers, which, by the way, is in a competitive market. They have to compete with other manufacturers. And to say that I don't think they make up this $213,000 cost. I mean, that comes from those who are in the business and who know. The 2,905 hours of paperwork, companies are sick and tired of this being imposed on them. And Congressman Guffey, why did Biden do this at the 11th hour? Why do you think he put this on as he was leaving office?
Know why he did it at the 11th hour, but, you know, as we said, I don't know why he added these at the 11th hour, but they're right. These regulations have been getting tighter and tighter over time. You know, from 1995 to 2005, the homeowner replaced their appliances every 12 to 13 years. Now with the new stringent standards, it's every 8 to 9 on average, and the price keeps increasing. And I've heard, sort of anecdotal, but me being one, my family, that we had to buy one because it was always available, and it doesn't do as good a job as the old one did.
And on the tire, on the regulations on the tires, that directly affected South Carolina. We've got Michelin, we've got Continental, and I think it's 11 major source facilities in 9 states, and South Carolina was one of them. I guess this is the same issue. Did any of your major manufacturers say they went along with these regulations? Did they write and say we would like to, because I didn't hear from them.
I didn't hear anything specific. But I would also like, if I could enter into the record, a statement of administration policy for HA Res 61 and one for HA Res 42, if that's possible.
Without objection.
Well, thank you for putting these up. Thank you for, I think it's the businesses that have to compete on a daily basis are sick and tired of unelected bureaucrats putting regulations on them, which make no sense. Just add to the cost of the final product. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield some time to my ranking member.
No, I find it interesting that I get admonished for going off topic, but Mr. Norman doesn't. But anyway.
I was responding.
I would like to have inserted into the record a letter that Lech Walesa, who was the man who collapsed communism in Poland with the help of Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, and 38 other former political prisoners have just put out, in which they strongly condemn the way President Zelensky was treated at that White House meeting. This new view that somehow Vladimir Putin is a good guy, that he's somebody we should hold up, that we can't criticize. I never ever thought that I would hear any members of an administration or members of Congress shower Putin with praise and go after someone like Zelensky, who's fighting for his life because of Russian aggression. I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I yield back.
Excuse me, just once. Did you ask for a letter?
Okay,
you kept going.
No, I want the letter in the record.
Without objection, it is entered.
Right.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for being so thorough, and thank you so much, Ranking Member, for raising that, because we are in a moment now where it is important to say who you stand with. And Republicans used to be the party that was so adamant against the USSR, against Russia, against Putin, who recognized him for the danger he was to the world. And it is really sad that we are not hearing more Republicans stand up for those ideals that they expressed. But tonight, we're on these rules, and tonight, we're watching Republicans protect home appliances rather than home health care. They're going to protect rubber tires rather than firefighters. They'll raise Americans' utility bills and health risks rather than raise concerns about Trump's tariffs or his love of Putin or the pardons of violent January 6th attackers. And tomorrow, Trump will impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And since we're talking about tires, let's look at the impact of those tariffs on cars and driving. Auto manufacturers have said they would pass the tariff costs on to consumers. Republicans have been quiet about how Trump's tariffs, wrecking ball, will increase inflation. Chairman Guthrie, do you know how much the tariffs are expected to raise the cost of buying a new car?
I don't have that in front of me. I didn't prepare for that, but I would hope that what happens is that the threat of tariffs will bring the tariffs down for other countries so we can have lower tariffs for everybody. I think that's the objective.
Well, that's really not the objective, and that's not what he said. He said it's about something completely unrelated. And what you're hearing from the auto industry, from the industry that you have sat before us today and said you're concerned about, is they are alarmed, they are against it, they are very worried. And the number that you don't have right before you, and I can understand why, is that it would raise the cost of buying a car $3,000 and $10,000 for a truck. Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce the article, U.S. Auto Industry Could Be Collateral Damage in Trump's Trade Wars.
Without objection.
And there, it's pointed out that it would pose an existential threat to the $300 billion in trade just affecting the auto market. And I think that that's really key, because if we're going to sit here and talk about the importance of manufacturing, because we're integrated, Canada is our ally. They're not our enemy. Mexico is an ally. They are not our enemy. The plants that exist, in my colleague states, depend on the trade that happens with Canada and Mexico. And this is going to increase the cost and make it even harder for families to afford not just a new car, but even an old car. Because once you raise the prices for something, you raise it for everything else. And let's talk about, okay, you can't afford a car, you've got your old car, doesn't have great gas mileage maybe, but you got to go fill it up at the pump, right? So under President Biden, America set records for oil and gas production, but we still import Canadian oil because, it serves in the middle part of the country. It's useful. Some gas refineries use it. And this is what has been said about the Trump tariffs. And this is from the Cato Institute. I'm always introducing material from the Cato Institute because nobody can say that's, Democratic or liberal. That's a right-wing institute, but they're very honest about certain things. He said, on the tariffs, how the heck does that shake out? My guess is that shakes out just through higher gas prices, particularly in the Midwest. So, Chairman Guthrie, have you spoken out against the tariffs? You haven't, because you just told me you think it's going to lead to good. Is that right?
Well, I just heard that President Trump has said, of course, this is something that he has the authority to do, that Congress has granted the authority to do. But I've heard him say, we're going to put tariffs on people that have tariffs on us. And I've heard him say that hopefully we could go, they won't tariff us and we won't tariff them. But but he does feel, and it kind of his whole being is, America's always been the one that's been taken advantage of, and he wants to equate that moving forward. So we're talking with some people in Europe just a couple of weeks ago during the presidential weekend, and they were talking about, well, they don't tariff us as much as the other. And then I brought up, well, your value-added tax. That adds about, can depend on the country, could add 26% to the price of an American product. And so what I hope that President Trump does is uses this process to get where we have all lower taxes on everybody with our allies, as you mentioned. They are allies, they are our friends, and hopefully they'll treat us the way that we'll treat them.
Well, what's interesting is tariffs are kind of a complicated thing. They can be used surgically, they can be used wisely, but what he's doing is just blanket tariffs, right? Like everything else he's doing, it's just chaos and confusion, just impose it on everything, rather than carefully thinking through what do you want with your policy objective. And the idea that it's not going to get passed on, Americans know that. Everybody is saying it's going to get passed on. Everybody knows it's going to be passed on. So for people who are saying it's not, that is just not the way tariffs work. They get passed on. But, I want to move to the issue of the utility costs. So, Ranking Member Pallone, efficiency standards help American households save money, right? And I've seen some numbers across the board about the different efficiency standards, because this is not the first time, we seem to have these home appliance bills. We saw them a lot last year, right? They had all those catchy names, hands off or refrigerators, they were just, because we used to say hands off our bodies, and so they were like, okay, let's use their catchy phrases. For women, it means our lives and our health. But can you elaborate on why these energy efficiency standards, including this one, which is about certification, why is it important for Americans and what they pay in their utility bills?
Well, first of all, you pointed out, as I have, that this resolution is not about the actual efficiency standards, but the certification that they're complying with the standards, which, again, I just don't know what, I guess they've been doing the efficiency standards for so many weeks now that they have to move on to something else that seems totally redundant, but whatever. Again, it's like my response to Ms. Scanlon. In this case, the Department of Energy, in the case of the rubber tires, the EPA, they have an obligation under the law that was passed many years ago, that periodically they have to look and see whether the appliances are efficient, because consumers want efficient appliances, right? They don't have to use as much energy. They want better stuff that costs less. And so that's what they did. The DOE looked at these standards and said, look, we can do this with less energy costs. It'll cost you significantly less for this appliance over a certain period of time. And then they meet with the manufacturers and they say, what is your opinion on this? And in almost every one of these cases that we've talked about now for several weeks, whatever the appliances, the refrigerator, the washing machine, whatever, these standards have been put together with the consensus of, I'll call them the good actors, the good manufacturers, who said, yeah, we can do that, and then we can save money to the consumer. There's nothing obscure here or surprising here. And these things for years were done on a bipartisan basis and nobody had a problem with it. I just think that the Republicans are running out of things to do here, and so they keep going. They look at the Federal Register and say, what can we do this week? I mean, this isn't even the standards. This is now the certification standards. So we're going to have one for certification of standards this week and next for certification of some other standards, and then where do we go from there? It's just...
Yeah, so the other thing that strikes me that with all of these energy efficiency standards, with these things, it's like none of this brings down the cost
just
for
the
American
opposite.
families.
Just the
And
opposite.
the opposite, right?
Right, because when
And
they review this, they have to look at the costs. And they only put these standards in effect if the cost is reduced. Now, my colleagues will say, oh, well, they have to pay for the upfront costs. Well, that may be, but over a period of time, whether it's 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it is, the consumer saves money.
saves money.
I hate to interrupt, but we are at the 11-minute mark.
Okay, great. So what we're seeing is I think that there is a pattern. So Trump gutted, they gutted the Consumer Financial Protections Bureau. No Republican raised a concern. There's talks about taking away the ability to negotiate with Big Pharma, standing with big corporations, standing with industry, and not standing with our consumers, not standing with working families. And, in contrast, Democrats passed laws that would actually reduce the cost to consumers I saw a number like $1 trillion. And so these kinds of things where we've been working on bringing down the cost, and Trump has been doing the opposite. Everything he's doing is raising costs. No wonder Trump is heading into tomorrow's address with the lowest favorability rating of any incoming president in history. Wait, actually, the lowest was last time Trump was an incoming president, because everything he's doing is not serving the American public and consumers. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Roy.
I thank the chair. I'll speak quick, and I assume Mr. Guthrie, you might have a few things you might want to respond to and all of that. I'll just open by saying that, number one, while I'm happy to work with organizations like Cato, they're hardly a far-right organization. They're a libertarian organization, which means I agree with them at times, and I disagree with them at times, which is true on both sides of the aisle, by virtue of their being a libertarian organization. That being said, Mr. Guthrie, let me just ask this simple question. Do the regulations that we're trying to address here increase the cost of appliances for Americans?
They do increase the cost of appliances for America.
Do they make it more complex and more difficult and more time-consuming for manufacturers to produce the products and deliver them to consumers?
That's correct.
So is the objective to minimize that so that consumers can have more cost-effective products and manufacturers can produce them more easily and more readily?
Well, that is our hope, because as my colleague here had mentioned, he said, well, we talk about the upfront cost versus the payback period. Well, the payback period can be years. So even if you do achieve lower energy bills with an appliance, but the upfront costs, it's far more than what I've seen. It can be up to 10 or 20 years, far more than typically people invest on a 5-year payback period. And so it's not economical for people to do this as well. It's not benefiting them in terms of when you throw in the upfront costs, which you can't dismiss.
Do you have anything else you want to add in response to?
I think I've covered it.
I yield back.
Thank you. And thank you both for being here today. The witnesses are excused. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
And I would now like to welcome our second panel, Chairman Westerman and Representative Elfreth from the Committee on Natural Resources. And I would like to remind the witnesses that your full statement may be submitted for the record, and we ask that you summarize your statement in 5 minutes. Chairman Westerman, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. First, I want to thank my colleague Senator Kennedy and Representative Ezell for championing this effort and collaborating with my team to advance this bipartisan resolution. SJ Res 11 nullifies a rule submitted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management relating to the protection of marine archaeological resources. The rule mandates costly, time-intensive archaeological reports for all oil and gas exploration or development plans, burdening operators with unnecessary red tape. The Biden administration replaced a flexible, risk-based approach where archaeological reports were only required in high-risk zones with a sweeping mandate requiring energy producers to develop reports for all offshore oil and gas activity. The National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, already provides a robust framework for a thorough review of offshore archaeological resources, engaging the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, stakeholders, and the public before final decisions are made, ensuring both energy development and historic preservation are addressed effectively. Due to this rulemaking, operators must now conduct extensive surveys using high-resolution geophysical tools to develop reports for every oil and gas exploration or development plan, even if archaeological findings have already been documented, or if there is no archaeological risk at all. BOEM's analysis estimates an additional 500 annual burden hours for the agency due to this rule, plus equipment and contractor cost. While framed as a safeguard for marine heritage, the rule imposed excessive regulatory burdens on domestic energy producers, increasing compliance costs and driving up energy prices for Americans still struggling to make ends meet after 4 years of record-breaking inflation. Offshore oil and gas production in U.S. waters puts America first, supports lower domestic energy costs, and creates good-paying jobs. This rule was part of a broad pattern of Biden administration policies that hindered offshore energy development and placed red tape on America's energy producers. Passing this resolution will support American energy security and further American energy dominance. allowing for the protection of historic sites without burdening energy producers with unnecessary regulation. I urge the committee to report an appropriate rule so this resolution may be considered in the House. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Representative Elfrith, you're recognized.
Thank you. Should I start over, Madam Chair? Okay. Material and cultural exchange, the history of science and technology, the history of shipbuilding, history of war, prehistoric civilizations, and natural changes to the earth. When the seabed is disturbed without careful archaeological surveys, these priceless pieces of history can be damaged or destroyed, like they were in the Micah shipwreck, which was bisected by the ExxonMobil pipeline in 2001, which very importantly cost that company $250,000 in fees to survey the damage and gather data on the vessel that would have been prevented had they done the survey in advance. That is why the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management established these guidelines in 1982, over 40 years ago, to ensure that artifacts are found and preserved prior to drilling, thus protecting the history and, again, importantly, protecting oil and gas companies from the liability of unknowingly destroying irreplaceable pieces of history. In 2006 and 2011, this rule was updated to ensure good faith compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, but BOEM recognized that the language required updating in order to provide oil and gas companies with more clarity and consistency and to ensure the best available science is utilized in these pre-drilling surveys. Senate Joint Resolution 11 seeks not only to undo that rule and the decades of modernization benefiting both, again, the archaeological discovery and, in this case, the oil and gas industry, it intends to prevent such a rule from ever being enacted again. Just a few key points. This 2024 rule is not burdensome. In fact, companies are already doing these surveys. The rule simply codifies industry standard practices for these surveys to ensure consistency, very important to the business community. It also allows archaeologists to compare apples to apples when evaluating the archaeological reports oil and gas companies have already been submitting for years. Number two, this rule will not cause a substantial financial burden to operators. BOEM reported that the total annual financial impact to the entire oil industry is less than $400,000 a year. For an industry with a reported pre-tax profit of $83.9 billion in the U.S. last year alone, I don't believe $400,000 is a fair amount to contribute to ensure preservation. This rule does not negatively impact America's energy dominance and independence. Again, as I'm sure this committee knows, the United States is already the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world. We are producing so much oil, more oil than any other country, in fact, so much that we are exporting that energy, which is actually leading to increased prices for our constituents. This rule did not even meet the threshold to require a statement for energy effects report, as it has such a negligible possibility of impacting energy supply, distribution, or use. This rule helps to protect oil and gas companies. It brings the agency and these companies into compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. Without these surveys, operators could discover these archaeological resources as they go to drill, forcing the costly delays, which is what we're trying to prevent. Companies still have to adhere to laws protecting shipwrecks and mitigate impacts to sites that were once above water and home to indigenous peoples. These sites, with or without this rule, are protected by the NHPA and in some cases by international treaties protecting historic shipwrecks. Lastly, this rule actually promotes efficiency, providing consistency to the business community, and protects oil and gas companies from wasted time and money. By mitigating the extraction and preservation of these artifacts, we are saving time and money in the long run, and it is much more damaging to the company's bottom line to have to stop operations if they are actually going to impact a sensitive area and suddenly handle that than if they had just surveyed up front. Rolling back this rule not only damages our ability to recover pieces of history that teach us about our predecessors and ancient civilizations, it also can hurt productivity and profits for oil and gas companies. Good policy, of course, we know means collaboration and compromise among stakeholders. It means that you may not get everything you want, but everyone will get something they need. This final rule is just good policy and benefits all stakeholders involved. It would set a dangerous precedent and prohibit this kind of solutions-oriented policymaking and roll back decades of bipartisan effort to preserve history. I urge the members of this committee to consider the cost of this action, and we will continue to be leaders in discovery or instead lead to the destroying of our own history. And I yield back my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Elfrith. I understand this is your first time at the Rules Committee.
Yes.
So we particularly welcome you to the Rules Committee. Chairman Westerman, this joint resolution already passed the Senate with bipartisan support. Why do you believe it's gained support across the aisle, given the remarks of Ms. Elfreth?
Yeah. Madam Chair, the bill, I think, gained bipartisan support because if you look at the senators that supported it are from western states where they're already seeing burdensome red tape in mining and energy production, and I think they, even though they're not producers in the Gulf, they see how the red tape's getting out of control, and I think they're saying enough is enough.
And to be clear, as Ms. Elfreth said, there's already a regulatory process in place to ensure that archaeological resources are preserved when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has a reason to believe they are present. Doesn't the current standard make sense?
Yeah, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act already protects these archaeological areas, and it requires BOEM. It applies to BOEM and energy production offshore. And, you know, what we're talking about most of the time are shipwrecks. And there's already been a lot of extensive mapping in the Gulf. There's a process there to account for artifacts. And this is just another duplicative rule that I think is being put in place to create extra burden on our offshore producers. And the rule really didn't even, or the agencies didn't consider the impact on small businesses. A lot of these operators in the Western Gulf are small operators, and these costs can be substantial to them.
Lastly, this mandate is sure to be inflationary, imposing compliance costs on energy development. Is that not correct?
Yeah, it's just another rule requiring mandatory and costly surveys that are unnecessary. There's already a process and a rule in place to account for this.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon, you're recognized.
Thank you. Am I correct? There hasn't been a markup in the House, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And the rule did go through cost-benefit analysis at the relevant agency and got feedback?
Again, from what I understand, this would, current rule only costs the industry $400,000 a year. Again, an industry that is 83.9 billion in profits alone. And again, it's our contention that this could actually save money and, importantly, time. If a project were to run into one of these protected sites, they would have to stop, delay, pay more in fines than if they had just surveyed to begin with.
So it's essentially a tweak to an ongoing process that has the potential for cost savings.
That's our contention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Griffith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you want to respond to any of these things they've been saying about this good little resolution?
Well, it's like you got a belt, now let's put some suspenders on and add a few $100,000 here, a few $100,000 there, and nobody's going to miss that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and people who come up with these regulations don't always look at the long-term economic impacts. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and it appears that these regulations a lot of times aren't necessarily about protecting something or saving something, but to throw another obstacle out there to prevent more energy production.
That's always been my feeling, too. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jack, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Question to the chairman, trying to understand the impetus of this rule. I know we've touched on it during your testimony, but was there a surge of damaged archaeological sites in the past few years? I'm trying to understand the impetus of this and would welcome thoughts for you as to why you believe the Biden administration rushed this rule after he lost the election. Why did that happen?
Not to be cliche, but it's another one of those solutions in search of a problem.
Wonderful. And as it relates to the cost analysis, just curious, I know the industry group notes that this rule is very ambiguous. So it's hard for me to understand how they could, specify a specific cost, or whoever the proponents of this rule may be, they say 400,000. As I understand it, it's very ambiguous, and it actually could, be far adjusted, much, much higher. Any comments on that, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with the costs that have been put out there, but I do know that the agency didn't include small businesses in their analysis. And, again, the small businesses are the ones that are going to get hurt the most by the regulations that they have to follow, just like the big producers do.
Sure. Well, I appreciate your leadership on this. Appreciate the committee's time and attention to it. Very passionate about CRAs because you've no doubt heard me over and over speak about the CRA last week. HJ Res 20 on tankless water heaters very specifically impacted my congressional district. So I applaud your efforts as it relates to this issue, and I will be in support of this rule. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Norman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Westman, for bringing this up. It's been through the Senate. This is, I think, as you mentioned, just another regulation on top of regulation. None of the manufacturers, none of the oil producers thought this didn't express an interest in passing something that like this that would add, I think, $5.9 million in compliance costs.
No, nobody's been beating our door down asking us to increase the regulations that they already have to go through to produce energy in the Gulf.
And Ms. Alfred, thank you for coming. This is your first time. Did I hear you right to say America is now producing oil from our reserves, because didn't the Biden administration pretty well shut it down, including the Keystone Pipeline?
Well, sir, I was not here in Congress during the Biden administration, so I can't speak to that. But currently, we are producing more oil than we ever have before, and our contention that we are, in fact, energy independent, so much to the fact that we are exporting excess oil.
We are now under Trump, or will be, but what's happened in the past, we're buying it from OPEC. A lot of those countries don't like us, and now you finally going back and using our reserves, and we'll be exporting, and we'll be helping the economy that way, because we're producing it. We've got a 100-year supply of oil and natural gas. Thank you for bringing this up, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. Mr. McGovern? No remarks. Mr. Roy, you're recognized.
I yield.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized. Thank you. I do want to make one quick comment. Ms. Elfreth, you said this only cost some kind of millions. I couldn't catch the number, but, people in my district think millions are a lot. And we had a famous senator many years ago who said, $1 million here and $1 million there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. Now we're doing that in billions, but I think if you spend $1 million here and $1 million there again, you really are talking about real money. So when somebody says it only costs so much, and you're talking millions, I think that's significant. But thank you both very much.
Sure. I think, I don't think she said millions. I think,
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. 400,000 is our estimation, and again, to do these pre-surveys, and again, in order theoretically and arguably to save money in the long run. So these projects without this survey could be affecting or impacting sensitive areas, and at that point, it would cause a stop work order. It would cause hundreds of thousands of dollars more in fines per violation, and so this is actually preemptively saving money.
and how much these companies make?
$83.9 billion.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Okay. We appreciate our witnesses being here. You're excused. Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair, or 5 minutes. The committee will reconvene. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the committee grant H.J. Res. 42, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Department of Energy relating to Energy Conservation Program for applying standard certification requirements, labeling requirements, and enforcement provisions for certain consumer products and commercial equipment. A closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.J. Res. 61, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 of the United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, rubber tire manufacturing, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of Senate Joint Resolution 11, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management relating to protection of marine archaeological resources under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources or their respective designees. Finally, the rule provides 1 motion to commit.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion?
Madam Chair, I want to make sure I'm clear. All 3 measures that we discussed today are being brought to the floor under closed rules. Am I correct?
Correct.
I just want to, again, say that's unfortunate, given the fact that there were no hearings on any of these matters or no markups in the committee of jurisdiction, but thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Hearing no further discussion, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
For a roll call, Madam?
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? Yes. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy? Aye. Mr. Roy, aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mrs. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Scott? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Jack?
Aye.
Mr. Jack, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? No. Ms. Ledger Fernandez, no. Madam Chair?
Aye.
Madam Chair, aye.
The clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Mr. Langworthy will be managing this rule for the majority.
And Mr. Neguse will be managing it for the minority.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.